Welcome to this step-by-step watercolour tutorial with some gorgeous sheep underneath some beautiful pink blossom trees. So, shall we get started? I'm actually going to mix up a variety of pinks. This is Opera Rose, a little bit of Permanent Rose. I'm using some Alizarin Crimson and some Quinacridone Magenta. And you want to mix up plenty of paint in a milky consistency. And I'm now mixing up some permanent yellow with some cerulean blue. So you've got a sort of light to mid green and then a very yellow green, adding a touch more yellow. So I've put some washi tape around the edge of the painting. I'm using cold pressed paper, 300 grams. And the washi tape is to give, at the end of the painting, a really nice white border. And I'm wetting all around the sheep with a flat, soft head brush here. It's a 1-inch brush. And it's just sort of wetting underneath the sheep as well. So don't worry about the sort of leg areas because they're going to be darker than the background. So I'm going to start off using my size 4 brush, painting wet into wet, some of the Opera Rose, and then dipping my brush into some of the Permanent Rose, then the Alizarin Crimson and some of the Quinacridone Magenta as well. Here we go, a little bit of Quinacridone Magenta. Now I'm dropping in some of that sort of limey mid-green there, still using the size 4 brush, dropping this in wet into wet. I've left some gaps where I painted the pink paint. So instead of painting straight on top of the pink, I'm painting into gaps and letting it bleed into one another so it doesn't turn into sort of a muddy mess there. So it's just to create an impression of all that blossom behind the sheep there. And just a little bit of grasses at the bottom there, using the tip of my brush. And I've decided to use just ordinary table salt. I've got a little bit in my hand. I'm sprinkling the salt across the damp paint. I'm going to allow that to dry naturally, so it'll create some lovely textured effects. I'm just softening now some of that wash there with a clean damp brush just underneath so you don't get any hard edges, and I'm just wetting all of the foreground now as well. I've decided to paint the foreground wet in wet as well. So I'm spattering some Opera Rose with my size 8 brush wet into wet in the background, and so I don't get any pink spots on the sheep, I've actually just torn some paper towel there and covered the sheep. And I'm carrying on spattering the Opera Rose, the Permanent Rose, the Alizarin Crimson, and then the Quinacridone Magenta. So I'm working at sort of a lighter pink, gradually working to the darker pink. You might notice not only is there spatter on the foreground and on the paper towel, it's also on the back of my hand as well and on my table surface. So when you're spattering, do sort of be mindful of your surroundings. You don't want to get that on anything valuable in your house. So do make sure you sort of mask out other areas besides your sheep. What you get with the spattering though is you get lots of gaps. So what I'm doing is I'm using my size 8 brush and I'm actually filling in the gaps now, painting wet into wet this lovely limey green. That's the Permanent Yellow with the Cerulean Blue. So it's a lovely spring green, and I'm just tapping this into the gaps. Keep reloading your brush all the time. Get plenty of fresh paint because your brush will become contaminated slightly with the pink. So I'm using a darker green now, painting damp into wet. That means the paint is slightly creamier, still using the same brush, and I am using that sort of mid-green, which is a little bit of Phthalo Blue with the yellow, so it's slightly darker in tonal value, so it's a little bit more of a shadow sort of colour here on the leaves there. What's great about the spattering as well, you get all these random effects and it's so much fun to do. What I'm doing now is I'm using my size 8 brush. I'm just stippling now with the brush some of the pinks, varying the pinks here and there, trying to be careful not to get any colour onto the sheep, of course, but you get a little bit more control this way. So I'm stippling a little bit of that green as well, carefully around the sheep there, just to build up that colour nicely, and it creates some nice texture. So if you didn't want to spatter, you can always stipple your background there, and you can also use sponging technique as well. So where the paint sort of dried off a little bit, I'm using a spritzer bottle here, clean water in there, and just spritzing some of that paint there, just to soften some of those marks, etc. If your paint runs onto your sheep doing this, just mop it off with a paper towel. I'm using a twig from the garden. I've sharpened it with a pencil sharpener. I'm scratching into the damp surface to sort of mark in where I want to paint some of my trees there. It's a really nice natural way of drawing rather than using a pencil, and it really loosens you up as well. I've also decided to sprinkle a little bit of table salt onto the damp background there. That should sort of lift some of the paint to create some really lovely light textures as well. So I'm concentrating a little bit around the sheep, around the sides and underneath. So I'm going to start painting the foreground now. Instead of starting with the pink, I've started with the green, because the majority of the foreground will be green grasses with blossom sort of petals that have fallen onto the grass. So I'm leaving some gaps there for that pink blossom. And again, this is a light to mid green, milky consistency. Using my size 8 brush, you can use a larger brush as well. Don't go too small with brushes on larger areas. I'm painting right up to the feet of the sheep there, painting in that foreground there. This is all wet into wet. Now going on with the opera rose in the gaps there, again some more stippling, tapping the brush, keep loading that brush, remember. And what I'm doing now is I'm actually using some Q-tips or cotton buds, dipping it into the paint there, and you get some nice marks using the cotton bud as well. And I'm just varying the pinks here and there and just painting this, again wet into wet. I'll put a link in the description below of a tutorial I made all about painting blossom trees using the cotton bud. I will also put a link in the description below of a few other sheep tutorials that I painted using the same sort of sheep but different backgrounds. An autumn and winter one you can find there. So I'm spattering some of the green now, using that phthalo blue with some of the yellow. Again, make sure you cover your sheep with some paper towel, because you don't want any green sort of or pink spots on there. And I'm just spattering some of the quinacridone magenta, trying to get bigger blobs, especially in the foreground here and there. So the quinacridone magenta is a darker pink, so it's quite nice in watercolour to work dark to light, and I'm spattering some of that darker pink at the top there. Have you noticed it's nearly dried at the top, so those spots aren't blending as much. I'm using my size 4 brush here just to paint some grasses just beneath the feet of the sheep there, and left and right of the sheep. So you've got that sort of background with the blossom trees and the foreground there with the grasses and the petals. And again, I'm spattering using the permanent rose, and this creates so much texture. Sprinkling a little bit of table salt now onto the foreground, using the twig to create some more grasses, lifting up some of that wet sort of limey green there. And now it's a good time to allow your painting to dry naturally, and this is the painting completely dry. What a difference that salt has made. It's amazing. So I'm going to paint the sheep wet on dry. I'm going to start with their heads. I'm using my size 6 brush. It's a 6 round brush, and I'm using Paynes grey with a little bit of the quinacridone magenta. You can use the alizarin crimson. So I'm just sort of painting these sheep straight out of my imagination. So I've really simplified them. So just sort of painting the ears and the sort of oval sort of face, the nose coming to a point, the legs, keeping those really simple, bringing these sort of feet to a point as well. And now I've taken the excess paint off on my paper towel, just lifting some of that paint off to show some light coming to the right hand side of the face, using a damp brush now to soften the legs, to sort of blend them in to the side of the sheep there as well, just to soften things back. You notice that I use my paper towel quite a lot to soften, so I'll rinse my brush to clean it, then take the excess off with my paper towel, just to ensure that I don't go back in with too much water or wet paint, whereas you could lose a little bit of control that way. So what I'm doing now is I'm painting some shadows here with that watered down Paynes grey with the pink. So it's very watered down. Rinsing my brush there, using a very watered down dark, lots and lots of water here, and then sort of blending up towards the top part of the sheep. And as I graduate up there, I'm going to get lighter and lighter. So the very top part of the back of the sheet you want to keep white as best you can. I've added a little bit of Paynes grey here and there, or maybe a little bit more of a pink shade, varying those colours so it's not one flat dark, and I'm just adding some clean water there as well to blend. So I'm working on the next sheep now, same process, working wet on dry with my size 6 brush, with that Paynes grey, with the touch of pink, the magenta, or the alizarin. And I'm just painting these back legs here, I forgot. So again, wet on dry. Keep these really simple. Don't overthink things, you know, when you're painting the legs, because again, it's from the imaginations. They're idealized sheep rather than realistic sheep. So I'm just painting these legs here, again narrowing the legs as they go towards the feet there, still using that Paynes grey and pink, and again using this very dilute wash here at the bottom, wet on dry, and even letting those legs, the dark of the legs, blend in there as well, adding a touch more Paynes grey there for a bit of dark. This is just clean water now, diluting. So again, as I paint the sheep, I'm sort of getting lighter as I go towards the top part of the sheep, just using clean water, graduating that wash. But don't worry about backgrounds or anything like that, because it just adds to the texture, because obviously these are woolly sheep. I've just painted a little bit of dark there, as you noticed, on the right hand side, and that's so I can get a dark and light contrast between the sheep on the left and now the sheep in the middle that I'm painting. So it pulls that sheep forward in the middle a little bit more, makes him look in front of the sheep to the left. As you can see, I'm using that paper towel to control the amount of liquid on my brush, and also to lighten up the right hand side of the sheep. So I'm carrying on now painting the leg, so following a sort of pattern now of the face first, lifting off the light, and then painting the legs, and then the shadow on the sheep, keeping the top part of the sheep nice and light, using my paper towel to control the liquid and the wetness or dryness of my brush. I noticed that I had some hard edges on the sheep there where the shadow sort of drifted up to the top part. I'm just using my little eradicator brush. You can use a synthetic brush. Don't use your good quality brushes here. You don't want to sort of ruin the points of them, but I'm just softening that sort of hard edge there. Keep doing that by rinsing your brush, taking the excess liquid off, water off with a paper towel, and just work at those hard edges there, and it will just smooth and soften that line. So just finishing off with a clean damp brush just to soften and to lighten that shadow colour. I'm also using that shadow colour to create some shadow underneath the sheep there, just where their feet are, to almost bury the feet a little bit. So your imagination makes up for what you can't see. I'm just using that Paynes grey and pink to do that wet on dry. I'm just painting a few grasses wet on dry in the foreground using my size 6 brush, just with that mid green, the cerulean and the permanent yellow. You can use cadmium yellow. And as I go towards the sheep, which is further away than the foreground, just make your marks smaller. It just creates a little bit of depth in your painting. I felt that shadow line was a bit strong, too contrasting, so I'm just adding a little bit of green just below it and softening with a clean damp brush so it doesn't have such a hard edge. To make this look more natural, I'm masking out the sheep again. I've mixed up some white gouache and some pink, and I'm just spattering around that area just to push it back a little bit here and there using my size 8 round brush. I'm painting in the trees now, using again that Paynes grey with the pink. You can use indigo and pink as well. It makes a beautiful sort of interesting colourful dark here for the trees. I'm kind of following the marks that I made earlier with the twig as well. I'm using my size 4 brush, but again use a brush that you feel comfortable using, and take your time as well. Remember, the tree trunks are the largest mark, so you can just start with those, and then you've got your branches were a little bit not as big as the tree trunk, bit narrower, and then you've got your twigs and things like that. So build up large to small and just take your time. You can turn your painting upside down as well, it really helps. And again, I've got my darks on the left hand side, the lighter part of the trees on the right, and as you can see, I have turned my painting upside down here. I find it easier, especially the top part of the trees, the branches. I just find it easier. I have a steadier hand working this way. I'm not leaning sort of across my painting. So I'm just sort of varying the colours here, but again keeping the darks on the left hand side. It's quite hard to say this when it's upside down. And of course, going from large, medium to small, those sort of branches at the top being the smallest. So using the tip of the brush. You can use a twig to do this, and you can also use a liner brush and a rigger brush. So use the brush that you feel confident and comfortable using. As you can see here, I've actually watered down some of that colour there. So I've got some paler branches and twigs, so they get push back a little bit to create some depth, and towards the sort of middle part here I'm just painting lots of thin lines there, just to create the look of lots of different branches, etc., here and there. So I'm just really freeing myself up now, just literally, they're not even connected. It just gives that impression of lots of branches, but I think it's a good idea now to allow my painting to dry. So I've turned my painting around now, and I'm sponging now on top of those branches, damp into damp, just to push those back and to make them look more natural. Now I'm using a natural sponge. I put it under the tap and wrung all the water out so it's damp, and now I'm sponging that sort of pink, you can use a permanent rose, with a touch of the Paynes grey, so it's slightly darker, and I'm just sponging this very gently onto the very almost drying surface here. And as you can see, I'm applying the paint directly onto the sponge as well, dipping it into the sort of wells there in my palette. And what I would advise you when you're sponging, don't press too hard. If you press gently, you've got the texture of the sponge. If you don't have access to a natural sponge, you can use an old scourer, or again, you can stipple these marks or even spatter them, but make sure that you mask out your sheep as well. So I'm sponging a little bit into the foreground, wet on dry here, just to create a little bit of depth. Bigger marks sort of brings that foreground forward, but I'm also sponging a little bit around the sheep there on the right hand side. So again, I've masked out my sheep with a paper towel. I'm kind of finishing off now with just using white gouache on its own. You can use white watercolour. I'm using my size 8 brush and I'm spattering wet on dry. It just creates a little bit of light and sparkle and texture. You know, 3 great reasons to spatter, plus it's so much fun. So 4 great reasons. You can also add a little bit of pink to that white if you want to, just spattering underneath the sheep here and also above, allowing the spatter to sort of catch some of their heads as well to finish off. So I've removed the washi tape now to assess it to see if I need to do any more to the painting. But I think I'll leave it there for now. I'm really pleased with it. I love all the textures, the colours, and of course those gorgeous sheep. If you have any questions about this tutorial, please put them in the comments section. And if you'd like to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel where you'll get updates of my latest tutorials. And if you'd like to learn more about watercolour, get access to downloadable outline sketches and exclusive content, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about that can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.